Hello again everybody. So in this video I'm going to focus briefly on some of the different ways that a very important theme, the theme of escapism, is presented, particularly in this early section of the play, but in some aspects that will follow on as well. And I would like to begin that then by talking about Marilyn Monroe, who you will see in a couple of photographs here. Very much an iconic figure who I'm sure you will either have seen in films, on posters, in all manner of contexts. Um, so, another picture there. So, what then do we need to know? Well, first of all then, a key word, a motif then, is a symbol that recurs repeatedly. A symbol is perhaps something that may happen once, but if it starts to become systematic or a kind of pattern, you can call it a motif. And so Marilyn Monroe can be seen to be a motif in the play Blood Brothers. But why? It's not just as simple as the fact that she was a beautiful woman and she's compared to beautiful woman. It's not that simple. But to understand it, we need to know who she was. So, Marilyn Monroe was a stage name because she was born Norma Jean Mortensen in 1926. At the age of 18 in 1944, she was working in a car factory, I think actually possibly manufacturing jeeps for the US Army during World War II, when she was spotted by a photographer. She became a model. By 1951, she was becoming an established actress. And for a long time, she seemed to have it all. She seemed to be beautiful, to be talented, and to have risen from humble beginnings, from factory girl to international sex symbol via modelling and actressing. However, behind that facade, there were a lot of, and in fact increasing numbers of, problems, because she went through 3 marriages, so a series of unhappy relationships, had a history of mental illness, possibly stemming from abuse which happened to her during childhood, and she died of a drug overdose at I think the age of about 36 in 1962. So, as an example of someone who seemed to have it all, who lost it all in a frighteningly short period of time. Now, why then is this relevant? Well, it's not just that Marilyn Monroe is an icon, but it's explicitly that she is very much a working class icon. She can be said to embody this particularly working class fairy tale, somebody who can come from nothing and reach the big time. And I would argue that the birth of this fairy tale that she represents, I would argue that it's probably just as relevant to somebody who wants to be an Instagram influencer now. People have this dream that they can, that they can get known and somehow be plucked out of their ordinary little life. It's a version of the same idea. I would argue that the influencer thing is kind of the modern equivalent, so the modern fairy tale version of this. So that's why she's a particularly working class icon, and that's why particularly people like Mrs. Johnston seem to identify with her. Now, the way that the references relate to her change during the course of the play. At this point, it's very much the 1950s. We're looking at Marilyn Monroe, the sort of success story, and so all the references to her are positive. Told me that I looked like Marilyn Monroe when he's trying to seduce her, for example. However, for an audience watching this play in 1983 onwards, there is a significant amount of dramatic irony here, because anybody who obviously knows about the Marilyn Monroe story, as many do, obviously, famous person dies, it was a big story, would know then that it's a foreshadowing of bad times to come. Foreshadowing then that Mrs. Johnston may be happy now, but unhappiness will come to her later. So in that sense, it's actually used in quite a tragic way, the way that it foreshadows the later tragedy. But by later on in the play, we have much more negative things. So, for example, when Mickey becomes addicted to prescription drugs, that is then compared to Marilyn Monroe. Mrs. Johnson later sings that she hopes he'll be okay, not like Marilyn Monroe. So, in a sense, as Mrs. Johnston and society grows up, the changing nature of the kind of Marilyn Monroe image is used to relate to that. So that's why the Marilyn Monroe thing is a key motif. But at this point, mainly positive, but with that sort of background foreshadowing of destruction. The second key motif then is the idea of the movies, of cinema. Relates then to the Marilyn Monroe motif, but it's different enough to merit a sort of second category on its own. Now, particularly in the early and mid-20th century, the cinemas were enormously popular. They were often modelled on theatres, were beautifully and brightly decorated. They were cheap, so many people went at least once a week. Apologies for my shocking spelling mistake there. And a ticket didn't usually let you see only one film, but there would usually be a whole series, so you'd be able to see a film, a news broadcast, there'd be a cartoon, often a second B movie as well, which is where that phrase comes from. And so really going to the cinema represented a good half day out. And for many people who still didn't travel far or have a television or even many books in their home, and especially before the 1950s when television started to become more common, cinemas provided a window into the wider world, especially with the advent of colour and sound, which happened from the 30s. You don't really get colour television until at least the 1980s, and probably perhaps a little before that, perhaps the 70s and 80s. But the point is, at this time, to be able to go to a cinema and to be able to watch a film in glorious colour is a huge escape. The surroundings, what you see, it's a big thing for many people. And finally then, this idea of dancing, and again, somewhat related to the idea of the movies, again popular at a similar sort of time. People would go to venues often known as dance halls or dance palaces, and the phrasing alone emphasises the sort of aspirational nature of this. It wasn't just a case of going to a club or to a disco, somewhere mundane sounding like that, but hall, palace, emphasised the sort of the illusion of luxury that these places tried to create. Again, attractively decorated, again providing a sort of maximum contrast from the drudgery of people's everyday lives. And often there would be no record player or radio in the home, so it might very well be the only place that you might hear music. Now, I think I mentioned this briefly when I was talking in my previous video about the Marilyn Monroe song, but I think here that the sort of romanticism of the Cinderella idea is absolutely crucial. Because again, if we're talking about working class fairy tales, that in itself is a kind of working class fairy tale. The idea of the poor girl who's a servant, but who can become transformed, marry the prince, and live happily ever after. I think that whole idea about transformation is exactly what underpins that whole idea about getting dressed up and going out to a dance. Dressing up, transforming yourself, that's psychologically, I think, what underpins a lot of it. And so when we talk about how Mrs. Johnston's fairy tale really is almost dead in the water before it really begins, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. There is a final other meaning of dancing, which I think sits slightly aside from the other ones, but it can also be seen as a sort of measure of compatibility with a partner. In metaphorical terms, even perhaps as a sort of counterpart for sex, and there are some references to that with Mickey early in Act 2, where it's used to kind of his reference to Mrs. Johnston referring to him taking up dancing can I think be seen as a sort of metaphor for his sexual awakening with relevance to his feelings for Linda as well. So that's three motifs then that are being introduced now early. What I would argue is that all three of these feed into this key theme of escapism, this idea of things which represent a way out of your everyday life, or a sort of respite from it. I mean, there are, even here, there are other things we could mention, like the reference to drug use, for example, in the case of Marilyn Monroe, which obviously doesn't crop up yet in the play until much later, when Mickey comes out of prison in Act 2. But again, even something like drug use, for example, might be seen as a kind of escapism, as a way of getting away from the reality of your everyday existence. But yes, we'll see other themes later that will feed into this key theme. Now that concludes this now. In my next video, I'm going to be talking a lot about some really important formal aspects of the play as a whole. So on that note, thank you once again, and I will rejoin you shortly.